Salut, my name is Gabrielle, and since we're all here to improve our French anyway, je vais commencer cette vidéo en français. Juste pour un peu de contexte, je n'ai pas fait de français pour mon ligne Cert, j'ai choisi allemand. Alors, pourquoi est-ce que je fais une vidéo comme ça? Attends, quand j'avais 18 ans, j'ai déménagé en France et je suis restée ici depuis. Mais je suis venue ici sans parler français du tout. Donc, j'ai dû apprendre très vite. C'était difficile, mais pas impossible. Alors, voici mes recommandations si tu veux améliorer ton français en peu de temps. So, let's get started. I'd like to just quickly start off by saying that playing video games in French was a huge game changer for me when I arrived in France with zero French. Even when I was in secondary school, I was never really into just like memorizing a ton of vocab and a ton of grammar. I just couldn't get that stuff to just stick into my head really easily. So when I arrived in France, I found that it was just so much easier to absorb vocab and like sort of grammar structures from video games than it was actually from the books that I had bought to try to teach myself some French. So when you're playing video games, you're learning all of that from context rather than from just a textbook. And as a side note, I actually met a ton of French people here that actually are completely fluent in English from just playing video games online when they were teenagers. So they'd go onto these like little chats with like native like English speakers, and that's basically how they learned like fluent English. So trust me, this method works. My first recommendation for a game that you could play is Stardew Valley. The idea behind this game is that your granddad basically leaves you this massive farm and you need to go fishing, you need to go raise animals, you need to go talk to the villagers. You basically just live out your life on this like little farm, and it is the coziest, cutest game ever, and I think it appeals to pretty much like anybody because there's just so much you can do in this game. This was the first game that I played in French when I arrived here, and oh my god, it taught me the fundamentals of French. The days of the week, the different like grammar structures, the past and the present tenses, and all of this like sort of stuff. And what's good about this game is that you can play it on your PC, on your phone, on your Switch if you have one, on basically like any console. It's available everywhere. And you can also play on like a multiplayer farm, so if yourself and your friends want to learn French together, you guys will be able to do that. Furthermore, my next recommendation is to play The Sims in French. Playing The Sims in French is a really useful study method because you can pretty much make your sim do whatever you want it to do. So if you're interested in learning more vocabulary about the family, you can make a big family and just like play with them. Or if you want to drill your verbs, then playing The Sims is brilliant for that because you need to click on them to make them do all these like different tasks. So I think it's a brilliant way to study some French. Furthermore, if you're a more advanced sort of French learner and if you already play Wordle, why not try play the free French version called 𝗏𝗏. It's basically the exact same thing as Wordle, except it's in French, and it's a brilliant opportunity to learn loads more vocab. And then finally, my last recommendation is to just replay the old games that you loved as a kid, but in French. So what I mean by this is Animal Crossing, Cooking Mama, the Zelda games, the Mario games, all of the ones that you still might have on your Nintendo DS. Replaying your favorite games is actually such a useful study method because you already know how to play all of these games and they're probably already pretty straightforward. So this time around when you're playing them, you can just focus on the vocabulary. So that's all I have for the video games. Let's move on to books. And I'd like to just quickly add here that if you like this video so far, please be sure to leave a like so that you'll be able to find it later on when you're looking for recommendations on how you can study French. And please be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. So if you're into reading anyways, I think a really productive use of your time could be reading en français. So here are my book recommendations for French. So my first recommendation is to try find manga and comic books in French. Honestly, you'd be really surprised to see how easy it is to follow along manga and comic books in foreign languages. So I'm currently reading through Sailor Moon in French, and honestly, it is delightful. I absolutely love it so far. To be honest, I'm really enjoying just reading the manga anyway, so it doesn't really feel like I'm studying French or that I'm putting like a lot of effort into it. The only thing I'd recommend here is that if you are studying French just to pass your 𝗬𝗏𝗡 exams, then I'd recommend sticking with manga that isn't sort of anything to do with like the fantasy world or magic, because that's the sort of vocabulary you really don't need right now. So I'd stick to sort of like real life situation mangas, if that makes sense. For example, if you're looking for a comic book to read completely for free and online, I'd really recommend reading the Heartstopper series en français. It is available completely for free and completely translated into French on Tumblr, and we will leave a link in the description box below. And then moving forward for actual book recommendations, my first recommendation would be to reread whatever book you read as a kid, but in French and as a teenager. In my case right now, I am currently rereading the series of misfortunate events in French, and it is absolutely delightful. I forgot how good this book series is, and I absolutely loved it when I was a kid, and so it's so much fun to reread it now as somebody learning French. And to be honest, even if you haven't read the series of misfortunate events as a kid, I would really recommend picking it up in French or in English actually. It's just a really fun series to read. It's basically about these like 3 kids whose parents passed away, and they basically have this like evil sort of uncle guy who's trying to get at their fortune, and yeah, it's just really funny even as like an older reader. I would definitely recommend it. Furthermore, if you're looking for more of a challenge and you don't really like reading children's books, then I'd really recommend reading 𝗟𝗶𝗶𝗹 en français. 𝗟𝗶𝗶𝗹 is a really classic sort of like book that pretty much every French person has read, and the vocabulary in it isn't that difficult, but I think if you are struggling with your vocabulary in French, then it might be a bit of a challenge to read, but it's not impossible, and it's very sweet. I would recommend for everybody to read it, even if you wanted to read it in English. But if you want to get better at your French, read it in French. And then lastly, I've seen that 𝗟𝗶𝗃 Comic has become really popular on BookTok at the moment. So if you're interested in his sort of like writing, then I'd really recommend reading 𝗟𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗀𝗃, but in French, obviously, which is basically the Strange Library in French. This is basically just a short novella about a boy who gets stuck in a library and his journey of trying to get out of it again. It was really fun to read, and the vocabulary in it isn't too difficult, so I definitely recommend checking that out. And if none of these recommendations suit you, then what I'd recommend is actually just going into your local library or the library in your local city and having a look there for any French books that you can find in the children's section. Most libraries in Ireland have a lot of foreign books, so you can have a look in your local one and see what's available, and you'll be surprised about what you find. So moving forward, here are some movie, TV show, and podcast recommendations for French. I grouped all of these together because by consuming all of these different things, you can really improve your French listening skills. So my first recommendation might sound like it has no business being in a video like this, but bear with me for a second. So I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, think that if you are to be watching the anime 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗃, then I think you should be listening to the French dub of it. It is so good, and it has no business being as good as it is. I've watched 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗃 in English and in Japanese with like the English subtitles underneath, and honestly, when I watched the French version of it, I was just blown away. It was like so good. So 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗃 is basically an anime about this guy who lives in Japan, and he just became super strong, and now he is very bored with life because he is so strong, nothing is a bit of a challenge for him. Normally, I'm truly not into sort of like fighty animes, but honestly, I feel as though everybody will enjoy this. It was just so funny. And what makes the French dub especially great is because the main character is voiced by Orelsan, who is a French rapper that everybody seems to really love. His rap is really good, and his dub for the main character is just absolutely hilarious. I would really recommend checking that out if you're into watching anime, or if you just want a really good laugh. It is brilliant. And then my next recommendation would be to watch Lupin, which is basically like the same vibes as Sherlock Holmes, but in France. in Paris. It is really, really good and it's available on Netflix right now. So moving on to some podcasts, I'd really recommend listening to the podcast News in Slow French, because the examiners always try to make the French exam relevant to like what's going on right now in the French-speaking world. Listening to this podcast would be absolutely brilliant right now, because all of their podcast episodes are very topical and I think they're updated weekly, so you'll be able to absorb the sort of vocabulary that is relevant right now and that might crop up on your exam. But if you'd like something a bit more lighthearted, then Duolingo has a podcast on Spotify and on Apple Music or wherever you get your podcast on. And you know what? It is actually pretty good. I would actually particularly recommend listening to their 6-part series called The Making of a Thief, which had no business being as good as it actually was. So if you're looking for something a bit more lighthearted, definitely check that out. And for those of you who have a really good level of French already and you'd like to get better at sort of more like real life spoken French, then honestly, my next recommendation is just to watch the stuff that you're watching on YouTube anyway, but in French. Like, for example, I watch a lot of booktube videos, and so I decided to further improve my French to watch those sort of videos but in French. Listening to French native speakers is so difficult at the start, and for a lot of the videos that I watched at the start, I actually had to like press that button in the corner that like slows the video down just so I could understand what is going on. But trust me when I say, when you get used to watching these sort of videos of like native speakers speaking French, it gets so much easier to understand over time. But if you find yourself really struggling in French and you aren't comfortable enough to listen to something completely in French, then my last recommendation would actually to be just turning on the subtitles on any show that you're watching right now. So it can be on Netflix or on YouTube. A lot of like these sort of sites have options that like you can turn on subtitles in like different languages. So even if you're watching a movie in English, just turn on the subtitles in French and you can be kind of subconsciously improving your vocabulary a little bit like that. It's not going to be as effective as just watching the entire thing in French, but it's an effort and that will hopefully add up to like improving your French a little bit. So before I get into the last set of recommendations, I'd really recommend for you guys to comment down below what works for you when you're studying French. Do you prefer to read books in French? Do you prefer to watch movies? Or do you prefer to just stick with drilling vocabulary with flashcards? I would be so interested to hear what works for you. And if you have any French like media recommendations, do also leave them down below. So my last and probably best recommendation for learning French without a lot of effort is actually to just consume social media stuff in French. I think we all already spend a lot of time online, so why not make that time productive? What I mean by this is that if you already really love to follow meme pages on Instagram, why not try to find some meme pages in French? In the same way, if you're already on Tumblr, why not make a blog for like the 𝗟𝗶𝗃 community and post about your French learning journey? And if you're already on Reddit, why not follow some French subreddits? For me personally, I really love French talk, I think that's what it's called. Basically, TikTok content in French. I find that absolutely hilarious and it's full of like really useful pieces of vocabulary that I just like consume without any effort whatsoever. And I find TikTok in particular to be like a really useful like thing to use for like learning a language, because there's just so much content on it and it's so visual. And personally, I have my TikTok set in French, so I love getting my little French like little TikToks whenever I'm scrolling through, which can be extremely funny. I absolutely love French talk. So if you have any French recommendations at all, feel free to comment them down below, and also feel free to let us know how you are feeling about the French exam. Are you super worried about your level of French, or do you have any other things that you want to mention about French? We would be so happy to make some more videos about this language, because it is something that I really struggled with when I first arrived in France, so I'd be really happy to further share my tips and tricks. So if you'd like to see those, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below. I really hope this helps, and best of luck with the study.